Hello everyone and welcome to Tech Update. Today we will be covering virtual machine configuration, the second episode of our VMware Workstation Deep Dive series. When configuring virtual machines, the default settings in the wizard are designed to get the system up and running quickly. However, they are often insufficient for performance and stability. Resource assignments made without understanding the underlying logic can bottleneck your physical machine or prevent the virtual machines from performing as they should. In this video, we won't just discuss how to set up a virtual machine, we will cover why and how to build an ideal virtual environment in great detail, from processor architecture to RAM management, disk controllers to critical BIOS settings. If you're ready, let's get started. Before jumping creating a virtual machine, we need to be sure some settings are configured accordingly. One of the most important topics is the enabling the virtualization support in your main computer. To do that, you have to go to your BIOS settings and configure it accordingly. For the reference, I'll be sharing the configuration steps for the MSI motherboards, but in your case, if your motherboard is different from it, you can search from the internet and configure it easily. After it, you can confirm it from the task manager. To do that, right-click the taskbar and click the task manager. On the left section, you will see the performance tab. When you click it and also click the CPU section, you will see this virtualization enabled. The second important setting is checking the virtualization layers. So in your case and in your environment, you may be using Hyper-V, for example. It is better to disable the Hyper-V settings before creating virtual machine in VMware Workstation. To check it, you can go to the control panel, go to the programs and features, and then click the turn Windows features on or off on the left section, and you will see the Hyper-V. Actually, until the VMware Workstation Pro 25H2, it was a must situation. So you have to disable it to be able to create and use the VMware Workstation virtualization environment. But in this version, actually, you can use both at the same time. But in some cases, there may be some performance issues in your environment. So to avoid these unexpected results, I strongly suggest to disable it if you are not using it. Otherwise, if you don't have a problem, you can keep it enabled. Let's start VMware Workstation Pro and get familiar with creating virtual machine settings. We can create virtual machine from the Home tab and click Create a new virtual machine, or we can go to the File section and click Create a new virtual machine. In this first section, the system asks us what kind of configuration do you want. We can either click Typical with fewer steps, or we can go with the Custom Advanced one. To be able to display all options, I will choose the Custom. In this section, the system asks us the compatibility option. Since I am using Workstation 25H2, I want latest hardware compatibility in my end. But in your case, this can be different. Maybe if you need to use this virtualized environment in another computer, and if this computer has older VMware Workstation, you may need to lower the VMware Workstation version accordingly. Otherwise, it's best to keep the latest one. Let's click Next. In this section, the system asks us if you want to specify the ISO file right now or decide it later on. So if we select the ISO file, according to the ISO file, the system will recognize the operating system. In some ISO files, for example, Ubuntu versions and also Windows 10, it also allows the easy installation steps. For example, if you go to the Windows 10 and click the ISO file, it says this operating system will use the easy install. The easy install means there are some settings that will create some kind of unintended installation as supplying some configuration settings earlier on the VMware Workstation, and these settings settings will be covered by the system itself. So we can choose this one if you want to install the operating system and configure some settings. But if you want full control installing operating system, we have to choose the I will install the operating system later. I am following the steps and clicking next. In this case, if you want to install the operating system, we can choose the version of it. Let's say I will install Windows 11 x64 and I am clicking it. If you want to install the Linux operating system, you can choose it and also distro according to your needs. Right now, I am just clicking the Windows 11 x64 and click next. So it asks us the virtual machine name and the location of the installation files. After configuring this installation, there will be some files and we will explain what do they work. So this location is okay for me, but the name is not. Let's change the virtual machine name and click next. Since Windows 11 requires encryption with TPM, the VMware Workstation asks us to add a TPM module and also encrypt the files. It can enable partial encryption or full encryption. Either them will work. So let's choose only the files needed to support the virtual TPM and create a password. In Windows 11, the only option, the firmware type, is the UEFI. Either you can enable the secure boot or disable boot. But in previous versions of Windows, you can also select the BIOS settings. In our case, these settings are fine and we can click next. The system asks us to configure the processor. I want to explain how does processor work. Normally, we have a number of processors section and also the cores per processors. So these are not the physical ones in our host computer. When we multiply these values, it calculates the total processor cores accordingly. So if we say cores per processor 3 multiplied by 2 equals to 6. The 6 is actually called vCPU, virtual CPU. So vCPU is equal threading in our main computer. So when we go to the task manager here and go to again performance and CPU, you will see that cores in my main computer is 10, but the logical processors, means threading, is 20. So I am actually sharing 6 threading or logical processors to this virtual machine, but it is not allocating it, it is just sharing it. So it means that when computer doesn't require more CPU, maybe it consumes very low CPU, my main computer can get some cores when needed. This is important because when we go to the memory section, you will see the different working logic here. For best practices, I strongly suggest number of processors to keep it 1 and change the cores per processors according to your needs. Because some operating systems may have some limitations. For example, if you want to install Windows Home Edition and if we select the 2 or 4, it will not get all the processors because it can only use one processor. And also this is important for some applications which licenses depends on processor count. So to stay on the safe side, I strongly suggest to keep the processors as 1 and change the cores per processors according to your needs. Keep in mind that these are not processors in the physical computer. And final recommendation is that please don't give too much CPU other than needed. Keep it minimum. It is important because there is some wrong understanding between people that if you give more CPU, then the system will run very fast. It is wrong. It only works if you only the necessary CPU. If you exceedingly give more CPU, then it will cause the system run slower than before. So I strongly suggest check it the CPU usage in a time manner and then give the right CPU accordingly. For now, for Windows 11, I believe 4 cores is very sufficient and we can click next. For the memory, this is allocation actually. It is not working like CPU. So we should give the memory according to computer's needs. So in my case, 6 GB is sufficient for it and I can click next. This section asks us the network type. Since I will be explaining the network in another video, I will not dive into it, but I can explain the network types with short explanation. Use bridge networking allows the computer to connect directly in our physical environment. So it gets a real IP from our current physical environment. Use network address translation, the NAT, is also allows system to connect to the internet and network, but it does only one way. So it actually have an IP address, but it is not the IP address on the current environment. The system translates it to the current environment's IP address, and it works like a router and allows the system to connect to the current physical network environment. But when the other computers or TVs try to reach to this computer, it will not work. So it can be selected for security purposes. The host-only networking allows full isolation from the virtualized and current environment. So if you need to do some tests and if you don't want to access this computer to the real network, you can use the host-only networking. And you can choose the do not use a network connection if you don't need network connection. So in our case, we can choose either NAT or bridge network to access to the internet. Let's click next. On this page, the system asks us which is the I/O controller do you want to use. We can select the recommended options here, which is the LSI logic SAS, and continue next. The system asks us the disk type. So there are some disk types as you can see, IDE, SCSI, SATA, and NVMe. And currently, modern and latest operating systems use the NVMe, and system also suggests it. And let's select it and click next. In this page, it asks us to select a disk. Since this computer is a new computer that we need to install operating system, we need to click to create a new virtual disk. But also, if you already created a virtual disk and use it in this virtual machine, you can select to use an existing virtual disk, like attaching it. Also, the third option is the use a physical disk. This option is appropriate for different scenarios, but not creating virtual machine. Because, for example, if we have a virtual machine and let's say we have Windows and Linux operating system installed on different disks, we may use a physical disk and map the disk which Linux operating system is already installed. So on this case, while we're using the Windows operating system in our main computer, we can also run the Linux operating system in a virtualized environment. This is just one scenario. For example, if you want to also analyze a computer disk which is affected by virus ransomware, but if you want to do it in an isolated environment, you can also use this option to prevent the threats spreading to the main computer. Right now, we are just selecting to create a new virtual disk and click next. In this case, it asks us to specify disk capacity. According to the operating system, the VMware Workstation already recommends the appropriate disk capacity. But if you want to change it, you can increase the size. There are some important settings on this page, like allocate all this space now. If you want this virtual machine run in full performance, and if we don't have any disk size issues on main computer, we can select allocate all this space now. It allows to allocate the disk earlier and it doesn't reduce the performance of it. But if we don't select it, the system will increase the disk size as we add the data into the disk. Additionally, we can also store the virtual disk as a single file or split it into multiple files. My suggestion will be to store the virtual disk as a single file because this will help the folder keep in tidy, and secondly, it will increase the performance. Then we are clicking next. It says specify this file. We can keep this name, but if you want, you can change the name of it and click next. The new virtual machine wizard displays the summarization for the configuration. So after confirming these settings, we can click finish. Otherwise, you can customize the hardware or go back to other settings to change it. Right now, we are just clicking finish. it successfully created the virtual machine. Let's jump onto the virtual machine settings to analyze it further. Right-click the respective virtual machine and click Settings. As you can see, there are two tabs, Hardware and Options. In Hardware, the first section is Memory. We configured the memory as 8 GB of RAM, but if you need to change it, you can do it here. Keep in mind that to configure most of these settings, you need to shut down the computer. The second option is the processor, and we configured the settings here. But in your case, if you need to create a nested virtual environment, you need to also enable virtualize Intel VT-X/EPT or AMD-V/RVI option. Otherwise, you don't need to enable it. In hard disks, it displays the location of the virtual disk and you can see the current size of it. In some cases, you need to defragment and also compact it. So defragment allows you to make the data untidy and it consolidates free space. But actually, the compacting it allows you to reduce the file size. So for best practices, first defrag files from here and then compact disk to reclaim unused space. You don't need to do it every day. You just need to do it every month or 15 days according to your needs. Also, from this section, you can increase the disk capacity like here. To make this happen, make sure that you don't have any snapshots in your virtual machine. Otherwise, you cannot do it. Expanding the disk size is not sufficient by itself. After you configure it, you also need to go to the computer management and refresh the disk, and then you can increase the disk size in the Windows computer. The other tab is related with the ISO file attachments. You can use physical disk drive if you have a CD-ROM, but these days we don't have mostly. The other option will be using the ISO image file. Since we use the Windows 11, we need to select the ISO file accordingly. Before saving it, make sure that Connect at Power On should be enabled to begin with this ISO file as a bootable media. The other section is related with the network adapter settings, so we configured it as they are. We have also USB controller option and we can change its compatibility. We have also sound card options, and if you want to specify host sound card, we can specifically specify it here. Right now the default one is okay for us, and we can also remove it if you want. The display option is generally okay, but if we want to make the Windows movements or mouse movements smoothly, we can accelerate 3D graphics. If we enable this, the system begins to use our GPU power and make this visualization much more better than before. And also, we have multiple monitors in our main computer. We can use multiple monitors and display it accordingly. For now, I will not use it, so I choose use host settings for monitors. And TPM module, as we know, Windows 11 requires it, and it is here. In the options sections, the general options is fine, and I don't suggest to change the version if we don't make any wrong configuration previously. But if you do, please select the right version with the ISO file. And also it displays the working directory here. In the second tab, the power options, as you know, we can start, stop or suspend the virtual machine or restart the guest. So these settings generally fine, but if you want to change their behavior, we can change it accordingly. The shared folder section allows virtual machines to access specific folder in our main computer. If you want to let them access to certain files, we can select always enabled and then map as a network drive in Windows guest, for example. We can do it, and after that there will be a shared folder wizard here, and we can select next and target a specific folder, and after that click next. I strongly suggest to click read only option here, because when we change the data in virtual machine, we actually affects the real files there. So to prevent accidents, I suggest enable read only option here and then click OK. Right now we don't need it, and I am just selecting the disabled option. In this option, we can change the behavior when powering off the virtual machine. The default one, when the virtual machine powered off, just powered off. But if you want, you can make it revert to a snapshot, or you can take a new snapshot, or allow system to ask me what to do. Normally, you don't need this kind of configuration, but in your case, if you need it, you know how to change it. AutoProtect is disabled. What does it do? Normally, we can take snapshots of the virtual machine. So to make it periodically, we can enable it. For example, we can select daily, hourly. In this case, if we specify 3 maximum snapshots count, it says we can keep it every day, every week, every month. So we can totally keep 3 snapshots like this time schedule. And if you increase it, we can also change the snapshots count according to the time. So you may want to increase this. Generally, I don't suggest to enable auto protect, because when you take snapshots, it makes the virtual machine slower. If keeping and saving the data is much more important than it, then you should definitely enable it. Otherwise, you don't need to enable this. I am just unchecking it and going to guest isolation option. The guest isolation option allows the system to drag and drop files from main computer to the virtual machine, or copy paste between them. So it is very useful, but maybe in your case, if you want 100% isolation, you may need to disable this option. So maybe you are working in an operating system, the files are affected by very dangerous ransomware and viruses. So disabling this option is good to prevent data transferring accidentally. Otherwise, you can keep it like this. The access control, as you know, we enabled the encryption for the Windows 11. If you want to change the password, we can do it. If you want to remove the encryption, we should first remove the TPM device and then remove encryption. The other option is VMware tools. Normally, the virtual machine will use the time configuration that is defined in it in the operating system level. But if you want to synchronize it with the main computer, we can enable this. Normally, the VMware tools will update itself automatically. But if you want to make it manually, we can select here. But I believe this setting is acceptable and the best one. There are some other settings, VNC connections, appliance view, and auto login, which is not too much important for now. But advanced settings, just information. If you want to change the firmware type, which I don't recommend after installing the operating system, you can do it from here. Changing it will mostly not allow the operating system to run. So I don't recommend it, but if you need to change it, you can do it here. And also, if you are experienced with the log analyzing, you can change the debugging information data from here and troubleshoot the problems as analyzing the logs. Otherwise, you don't need to touch. And after these configurations, we can select OK. Right now, for demonstration purposes, I will just display how you can run the virtual machine as booting with the ISO file. To do that, select the virtual machine, right click it, and go to the startup guest, or just click it here. After that, click the blank section and says press any key to boot from the CD or DVD. So when we do that, Windows operating system will boot from the ISO file and then begin the installation. So these are just the settings when we boot the operating system. This can be Ubuntu, this can be CentOS or Windows 2019. So you just need to make sure you have to choose the right ISO file according to your needs. After that, you can continue for the installation part. Right now, I am just shutting down the operating system. And finally, I want to give some information about the virtual machine files and what are they for. To go there, we can go to the library and right-click one of the virtual machines and click Open VM directory. In the first file, we can see the LCK. The VMware Workstation can help to prevent some interruptions that can be done by the other applications or a second instance of the VMware Workstation. So when we open the VMware Workstation, it automatically creates this file and it keeps the environment consistent and stable. When we close it, as you can see, it it is disabled. Let's open it again. And secondly, there are some log files which contains some events regarding to the environment and the data, so we can troubleshoot if you want to. Also, the NVRAM file which contains the UEFI and BIOS settings. It's like a virtual BIOS chipset that resembles to our physical computers. Also, there are some scoreboards for the virtual disk and also the delta file disk. Scoreboards contains the stats and performance data in it. The VMDK file is the main disk file, but as you can see, there may be more than one VMDK file. Actually, these are different. If you check it closely, you will see that there are some -0001 and -0002. This means that these files are the delta files, the snapshot files. We can say that there are totally two snapshot files. And when we right click it and click snapshots, as you can see, there are two snapshots here. These are the delta files of them. So this is the main virtual disk file and these are the delta files. And for each disks and delta files, you will see the scoreboard file. The VMSD file contains this chain actually between the virtual disk and the delta disk. So when we take snapshots, it is important that to be able to return the exact moment. So these data should be covered by the VMSD file. The VMX file contains the hardware information of the virtual machine. When we right click it, we can see the details here, as you can see. There is also VMXF file. This contains some hardware configuration and you can also open it with the Notepad editor. There is finally the VMSM file. This file contains some snapshots data. For example, if there are some opened windows and clipboards, these data are inside these VMSM files. And when we want to restore the snapshots, we can go to the exact moment with the help of these guys. So these are also important. I believe we can end this today's session. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one. Bye.